Have you ever been on a roller coaster and realized you may have gotten yourself into a little bit more than you bargained for? The hill keeps climbing and climbing, just a bit steeper than you anticipated, and when the swoosh down and gravity feels like it's gone away, and then before you know it, it's back again, and you're shaking against the restraints in your seat, and then the corkscrews and the dips and the turns leaves your stomach 20 feet above where you are, and then it comes to an abrupt halt, and some underpaid kid comes along, lets you out so that he can strap the new folks in, and after it's all done, you turn to the person next to you, and you say, man, that was the craziest roller coaster ride I think I've ever been on. How insane was that? And the fellow sitting next to you says, well, actually, that was my very first roller coaster. And you're like, oh my gosh, you don't even know how next level insane that all was. I had this experience, or something very close to it, a couple of months ago. At one of our first receptions together, I was sitting next to Matt Russell, who gets a little shout out for inspiring today's sermon some, from the search committee, and I was having this feeling, and I turned to Matt and I said, "How crazy was search this year, man?" And he said, "I don't know, that was my first one." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, let me tell you how different that was compared to all that went before it." One of the most notable ways in which the search process was different this year was that it was all online. That meant no pre-candidating interview and no candidating week. Of course, when you are a contract to call minister, we like to say that candidating week is 3 years long. And I hadn't realized how much I had sort of used what we call pre-candidating. That's where you preach in another congregation, and yet you're there for a weekend with the search committee, and they interview you and do all that stuff, which we now do online. But I hadn't realized how much that was a reference point for me. By doing all of that stuff online, watching each other's YouTube videos, it can be kind of hard to get a sense of where you stood. I was talking to a colleague who was also in search this year, and we started joking about it, being a little silly, as you do to sometimes relieve the tension. And we said, basically, we cyber stalk the congregations and they cyber stalk us. Maybe it's part of some, and then we really got into like the conspiracy theories. Maybe it's part of a UUA strategy to give the YouTube pages of these congregations a bump up in views, Help that collective algorithm that we're always trying to, ministers all watching all the congregations, all those search committee members watching my church's YouTube video. And, I'm of a certain age, and perhaps my younger colleagues are a little bit more used to being online than I am. But I do remember preaching basically every sermon in February thinking, how many people are watching me right now? So, since there wasn't a chance for me to preach a sermon during a candidating week, my title for today is The Sermon I Didn't Get to Give, because the process changed. I want to hasten to add that this is in no way a critique of the Transitions Office, the UUA, or anyone who works there. So don't read that into this. And I say that because when you sort of complain that nothing ever changes, and then when that thing changes, you can't complain about how it changed. The Transitions Office is literally in an interim period itself. We have an interim director of the Transitions. And so they're, as you guys know about interim ministry, you're kind of experimenting. You're trying different things and seeing what works. And this change to online is to really help search be less expensive, particularly for small congregations who are kind of already behind the 8 ball. And pre-candidating winds up being one of the biggest of those expenses. But one of the functions of the sermon in that old process was that it gave the minister kind of a chance to introduce themselves more directly to the church. And that really is what I'm trying to do this morning, though, of course, it's going to be an ongoing process for us. And another disclaimer I want to make is I don't normally talk about myself this much in sermons, but I find it fascinating to see things from different points of view. I've done search a few times as a minister. One time I engaged the search process as the chair of a search committee when I was looking for an assistant minister in Delaware. And even once, in the very brief time I was a layperson, my home congregation in Ann Arbor engaged in a search. So I got to experience that piece of it too. It really was that conversation with Matt that got me thinking about my past experiences with the search process, which I suppose is as good a place as any to introduce you to Reverend Josh. My first engagement in the search process was in the year 2000. That's the same year I graduated from Meadville Lombard from seminary. And it's a little awkward because all of us who were graduating were all applying to the same churches that were in search. And so you sort of knew who your competition was. It was all your classmates. But that's the nature of it. The search process is tough. And it's easy to get your feelings hurt. No one likes to be rejected or being told that they aren't going to go to the church where perhaps they had their hopes set. If I can paraphrase Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights, in search, second place is just the first loser. It's a winner-take-all system, and no one gets any silver medals for being the first runner-up. Although, I have collected over the years a little file of rejection letters from congregations. These are churches that saw something in me. Even though they went with another candidate, they felt that they wanted to affirm something in my ministry. And these are some of the best letters I have in my collection. I've been rejected by some of the best churches in the UUA, let me tell you. In my first search, the Reverend John Weston, now of beloved memory, but for many years was someone I greatly admired, had come on as the head of the transitions office. He was the first one to put ministerial records and congregational records online. Before that, everything was done on paper. Most critical to this process was that both ministers and congregations would make what we called packets. And these were essentially 3-ring binders full, for the ministers, they were full of sermons, letters of reference, your CV, and so on. And if a search committee was looking at ministerial records and they wanted to know a little bit more about you, they would email you a FedEx number, and you'd go down to FedEx and you would mail them your 3-ring binder packet, and they would FedEx you theirs in turn. It took forever. I once got a packet back that had another colleague's sermon in it, by the way. It was kind of interesting. One day, kind of while we were we hadn't quite yet graduated, we were all in the search process in my class, and one day in seminary, I'm chatting with a friend of mine who said, Hillary has lavender and white as the color theme for her ministerial packet. Color themes? Where was I for arts and crafts day at seminary? Now, you should know I am partially colorblind. And so visual arts are not my medium of choice. But it was an early lesson that ministry sometimes demands unexpected improvisation. I did my best to present myself in my packet, but there certainly wasn't a color theme to it, I can guarantee you. Now, I was not successful in that first search. People in interviews would ask me what I like to call young guy questions. What makes you think you could actually be our minister here, given that you're 26 years old and have no experience? Most weren't that blunt about it, but that was the question that was kind of lurking behind all of them. At one point, I received a very kindly email from John Weston. He suggested in the body of his email that I be open to feedback. And as I read below, I saw that he had subsequently forwarded me an email he had received from a search committee member complaining about how low quality all the ministers' packets were. And it contained something along the lines of, and just look at Josh Snyder's packet, it's the worst of them all. It's especially bad. This dude took time out of his day, emailed the head of the transitions office at the UUA to highlight just how bad my packet was. Now, fortunately for me, the Second Unitarian Church in Omaha, Nebraska, asked me to be, essentially, a contract to call minister. What was called extension ministry back then. Now, it was a small church that had been intentionally planted in West Omaha by the larger downtown church back in the late 70s. Second Unitarian was a family church, and they had not been able to afford ministry for 12 years until the tech boom in the 90s sort of helped buoy their finances some. But they decided, hey, let's take a chance on the kid with the ugly packet. And they wound up calling me, and I stayed there 8 years, double the tenure of any other minister that had served up until that point. The goal of my going to Omaha was to kind of reestablish ministry there, and I'm happy to say Second Unitarian continues to have ministers to this day. How different things are now. Packets got phased out about the 3-ring binders, got phased out about 10 years ago in favor of the websites. Now anybody on a search committee can, and as you all know, in the church later on, can view that website at their leisure. They don't have to pass it around anymore. Of course, congregations all have big budgets and super smart congregants who probably do web design professionally, working on your website or the search section of your website. I, on the other hand, felt a little bit like I did back in seminary. Now I got to learn how to build a website. The unusual skill sets that ministry sometimes demands of us are well documented. Another part of that process, as I mentioned, is watching YouTube sermons. This was smart because so many places had to go online because of the pandemic. So I jumped into watching your YouTube channel with great enthusiasm. I started with Reverend Dawn sometime around last Christmas and started working my way backwards, because that's how YouTube operates, and got into Jamie's time, Reverend Jamie's time somewhere, I don't exactly remember. Saw sermons from some old friends that was kind of fun. Dennis McCarthy. I was on the committee that did Dennis's admissions interview to Meadville Lombard a million years ago. And he and I have been friends ever since. Never fear, he'll continue to preach here. And then it dawned on me, there's 2 churches in Indianapolis. What do they do over at All Souls? They have the UU tradition, just like UUI does. They live in the same city. What do they do with it? How do they understand that? And so I started watching a bunch of All Souls worship services too, and helped me to learn about some of the similarities and differences between the 2 congregations. I'm a big fan of Reverend Katie and Reverend Nancy, and I know that they're going through some transition over there. But collegial support is a very real thing for us ministers considering a new placement. My friend Susan Frederick Gray, my friend Nick Cable are nearby. Reverend Nick, who's minister in Columbus, Indiana. He and I know each other through a ministerial study group that we were both in and already have lunch scheduled. So that's a real joy. At its peak, I was probably watching 3 to 4 of your worship services a day. As I've said to some of you, you are famous to me. If you were somebody in that time period doing board announcements, see, the sermons, they left with Dawn, right? It was kind of, she had some good sermons, I thought, but I was really interested in the announcements. Who's standing up giving announcements? What are they saying? Stuff like that. So if you did announcements, if you were a worship associate, if you did music performances or a summer service, or if you were just a cute couple that dropped stones in the water, you became famous to me. This meant that I kind of watched you do the search process in reverse, going all the way back to how you selected the search committee. It took 2 years of what I would call actively engaging the search process for you guys. I'm not sure that you fully comprehend how long that is. And in contrast, I didn't update my ministerial record until last Thanksgiving. Almost a whim by comparison to all the hard work you guys had done. I had forgotten what it requires of congregations to gather demographics and surveys and the conversations, and then expect the search committee to integrate all that into what I know the UUA is asking them. They ask hard questions. I know because they ask us ministers those same hard questions. That way, the church and the minister can line things up and compare apples to apples. Does my answer to the question about RE or anti-racism fit with what the search committee has said about those topics? That is super helpful to us, both to them and to me, so that when I line up the stats, if you will, I can compare UUI to other churches roughly the same size. Any guesses what I found when I did that? This is not scientific, incidentally. It's just the churches that I was in search with. Everything looked pretty normal, pretty standard, what I would expect, except for one thing. UUI has a higher RE attendance than most churches its size. Well, that seemed to kind of fit that narrative, right? That we value our kids and our youth and are part of this congregation. And I wanted to kind of say that to you all, that the information the search committee gathered from you was not in vain. It helped me a lot. It allowed me to make meaningful comparisons to other churches, and that's a big help in selecting where to go. Of course, search is all about the waiting. In the thick of the process, you are either endlessly bored, incredibly anxious, or feeling like you should have turned your homework in last week and you have to do it all at once. The funny thing is that as I was watching Reverend Dawn preach to all of you about being in the search process, it felt like she was preaching to me too. One time, in the middle of this sort of search doldrums, when nothing was happening, Sherry texted me and said, "So do you feel like a jelly donut?" If you remember Reverend Dawn's anxiety smooshing out the side of a jelly donut. And finally, it comes to that big decision day. Which church or churches would want me, and where would I go? Now, you all know the date, the search committee, or the deadline for making that decision. I know both board and search committee knew about that date. And you have to be open to all the possibilities, which is really kind of the hard part. Life could take you 3 different places or nowhere at all. And so came the time when I asked my wife, Sherry, "What do you think about Indianapolis?" Without hesitation and with enthusiasm, yes. That was all the recommendation I needed. I distinctly remember getting up early, I think it was maybe the next day, and emailing Eric Kamenitsky, the new interim head of the transitions office, and I'm coming to Indianapolis. And then I sat down and watched Reverend Dawn's sermon on anticipation. I don't know if you remember that. I was like, aha, I felt like the cat that ate the proverbial canary. I'm the only one. Right now, at that moment, I'm the only one who knows who your next minister is going to be. But it was somewhere between Sarah Cannon's story about the kid who was looking for their monster and Reverend Don's sermon reflecting on who your monster will be, that the tears began to flow. We had found each other. They say that you meet your congregation 3 times. The church on paper, the church represented by the search committee, and the church when you are among the people. I might add that there's another level, the church when you are there doing the actual ministry. I just came from a congregation that was a little smaller than you are, and I forgot how larger churches, mid-sized churches feel. You have a higher energy. You vibrate at a stronger pitch. There's a rhythm of church and how it happens at this kind of faster tempo. And it had me feeling a little nostalgic, actually. I remember things being like that, churches that had a lot going on at first. You know, UUI is a train that doesn't stop. Oh, sure, you slow down a little in the summer so that the new minister can hop on, but the train doesn't stop. A minister coming into a church always comes into the middle of the story. And so I'm going to be curious about what your story is. You're going to hear me asking lots and lots of questions. Things like, what do we care about at UUI? What do we worry about at UUI? What angers us? What inspires us? Where do we put our precious time and energy? These are all things that I'm going to try to learn. And time again, you have impressed me. For you see, friends, ministry is not simply my job description. It is our life together in a way that is faithful to our UU values, principles, and tradition. That is not as easy as it sounds. But thankfully, ministry is what we, the church, do together, not just the work of a single individual. In the words of the liberal theologian Frederick Buechner, who was not in Talladega Nights, ministry is where your deep calling meets the world's deep need. Ministry is the intersection of the Unitarian Universalist tradition in all of its richness and complexity, its teachings and its failures, its proclamations and its learning, where it meets the demands of the age in Indianapolis, Indiana in 2026. And let me tell you, there's a lot to say, to think, and more importantly, to do about where our calling meets the deep need of our community and our nation. May we seek new ways to do the work of ministry while we celebrate the accomplishments of the past, for both make up our living tradition. May the ministry we do together be worthy of that living tradition so that all, without exception, may know peace, love, and justice. Friends, let us be about the work. Amen, and blessed be.